Tonight's Unmasking Human Trafficking CLE is hosted by the Law and Government Institute here at Widener. We will begin tonight's event with a brief statement from Attorney General Michelle Henry. General Henry, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Widener, so much for hosting this important event. And thank you to our panelists tonight that are here to discuss human trafficking, which impacts nearly every community in Pennsylvania and beyond. And thanks you to all of you that are here to learn and to listen to this, because I think it's so important. When I was asked to do this brief introduction, I immediately said yes. And, you know, I'll just say for a long time, I was a prosecutor in a local DA's office, and I did a lot of child abuse cases and sexual assault cases. And I remember when I was struggling and putting these cases together, I would look at my colleagues who were in the narcotics section and were handling primarily drug cases. And I used to think, although that's important work, how much harder these sexual assault cases were. And I would think, you know, they're typically putting up in a narcotics case police officers and detectives who testify day in and day out, while I was struggling to put up a 16-year-old who had been sexually assaulted and raped by her biological father from the time she was 6 to 16, and all the trauma and all the difficulties that go with that kind of prosecution. And now here we are with human trafficking. And when I think about human trafficking, I think it is even a higher level up in terms of how difficult these cases are. Because of the victims and for a lot of other reasons, but primarily because of the victims and how traumatized they often are and how brainwashed they often are and how difficult it is as a prosecutor to put these cases together. So I am encouraged by the fact that all of you are here and that we have an unbelievable panel that we can listen to tonight and learn from. So I'm sure you'll enjoy this CLE because this panel is really top notch with a lot of experience. And the critical part about this panel is that they are the team, the kind of collaboration that you need to successfully combat this problem. Starting off with Heather Castellino, who I've known for a long, long time. She is a Senior Deputy Attorney General at the Office of Attorney General. She's been there for quite some time, and she has prosecuted many of these cases, very, very tough cases. And she has been sharing her knowledge, her skill, her expertise with others to really share this information so we can combat these crimes. And I know Heather will have great insight and provide some real interesting thoughts on how we can take this problem on. Next up is Steve Turner, who works up and down the East Coast across the country, really educating the public and helping victims and the agencies involved with these types of crime. And of course, the Pennsylvania State Police, which continues to be a great partner to the Office of Attorney General on so many different types of cases, but in particular, these cases. And last, but certainly not least, a thank you goes to UPMC Pinnacle for taking the lead role to really stress how important the healthcare process professionals are when we're dealing with these cases. Again, without their commitment and the network, we would be missing a critical component, which is the aftercare for these victims. So I think it's so important that when we have these types of agencies come together and collaborate together to address this issue, we can move forward, and we need to move forward. Again, as Attorney General, I have come to see how important it is that we look at this, and the fact that it is in every community. A lot of communities, a lot of people might say, well, it's not here, it's there. And I know how difficult these cases are, how important this work is. And as I said, it takes a lot of learning. We need to expose the light on this, and we need to have collaboration. So I am so grateful for the individuals that are here tonight to talk about this important topic, and I will turn it over to you. But thank you, one, to the panelists, and two, to everybody that's joined in to learn more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Henry. So we will do a brief Q&A session at the end of this. Those of you on Zoom, please direct those messages to me, Jessica Collier, and I will moderate those questions. Next is Steve Turner. Steve is an anti-human trafficking consultant, trainer, and advocate. Steve, thank you. And now I turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. Hey, thanks everybody for being here. And thank you to Attorney General Michelle Henry. I mean, yeah, she was a line prosecutor. I mean, she did so much hard work, child abuse, sexual assault, and those cases. And for those of us in this room that you're going to hear from, I mean, this is a CLE about trauma and trauma to human beings. And it's very different than a bank robbery case. It's very different than a hand-to-hand drug buy case. We're going to talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking, probably a bit more about sex trafficking because that's more prevalent. We've got a lot of work to do on labor, and we need to do more labor trafficking work, and we are working on that collectively. But yeah, so you're going to hear from, it's just great colleagues here. Heather Castellino, Senior Deputy AG, Organized Crime Unit, does OC, organized crime cases and trafficking cases. And like Michelle said, I mean, these cases are some of those difficult cases because of the trauma and the damage and the fear that our survivors, our victims experience. It's how do you, and so Nicole Basil, who's the lead forensic nurse at UPMC's 7 South Central hospitals. In fact, one of her team members here, the forensic nursing team, is here. I mean, what they do, think about this. Nicole and her nurses are on duty 24/7, responding to 7 hospitals for sexual assaults, domestic violence, and human trafficking. And they're dealing with people. You want to talk about the worst day of your life? It's one unending series of the worst days of your life, and you have to be not only incredibly competent, but compassionate. Jessie Williams, state trooper, eastern part of the state. She is in charge of and works with making sure that the eastern half, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in state police land, is working trafficking, is aware, processing leads, making things happen. And you can't do that without an intelligence analyst, Carrie Dwyer, state police intelligence analyst, who then works with the prosecutors, works with the cops, works with that team to process mounds and mounds of information. Now, this is a different CLE. This is a different kind of CLE than somebody standing up here with 4,000 cases, 900 footnotes, and on and on and on. You're not going to hear a single thing about it, sending opinion, a drop footnote, or anything else, because this is real life. But this also presents ethical conundrums because it's a different type of case and work. And lawyers who are on this and law students, it's a different planet and a different experience of humanity that we're going to do. So trigger warning. And the Attorney General already did it. I'm doing it again. We're going to talk about human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, murder. This is horrible. There is no Disney or Nickelodeon version of this. None. Sorry. So, but here's the thing though, too. We have an obligation. I have an obligation. All of us on this panel have an obligation. If anyone, either on Zoom or here, if this is triggering in any way, number one, We're sorry. But it's real. So please, 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 self-care, take care of yourself. Because vicarious trauma, you will see it in me at different points. Because it is impossible to not be with human beings that have gone through this and not be affected. And the day this doesn't affect me, and the day that it doesn't affect these panelists, is the day we all cash in and do something else. Sex trafficking, commercial serial rape. Many of the survivors that we have, I work with the YWCA of Greater Harrisburg, and we're the lead agency for a 13-county federally funded Office of Victims of Crime anti-trafficking project in Central PA. We pieced together 4 other domestic violence sexual assault centers, the YW in Harrisburg, domestic violence sexual assault 24/7 hotline, 22-bed shelter for women and women with accompanying children for domestic violence and human trafficking. Male victims we house off-site secure facilities and bring them in. But this is what the many of our survivors will report: 15, 20 or more rapes per day. How do you get your hands around that? Medically, psychologically. So, different spin on ethics and ethics considerations. So, I mean, this, when you look at trauma and human beings that have experienced and survived trauma, then we as lawyers have to be competent, and it's a different kind of competence. It's way beyond not blowing a statute. It's way beyond, like doing the best job we can, because these folks who have survived this, they come to the table carrying a bag of barbed wire and rocks and scorpions on their back. And we have to be sensitive to that and help them. So this is different. Confidentiality of information. This is a different spin on this too. I mean, and what we see at times is, obviously attorney-client privilege, we guard that, etc. There's cutouts for this. If client tells you they're going to commit a murder, serious bodily injury, things like that, I mean, we are unbound in terms of that. We do not have to let a homicide take place and say, oh, it's attorney-client privilege. No. But you also have to take care of your client. And that's where this then feeds into diminished capacity. One of the things that, and you're going to hear this from Nicole, but you'll hear it in different iterations from all of us. The cumulative trauma of either the sex trafficking or the labor trafficking. Labor trafficking, 18 to 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, no day off, nothing. There's no OSHA out there. And in fact, when Nicole and I do rounds together in the emergency departments in those 7 hospitals in South Central PA, when we're talking with nurses, and when Morgan, who's part of the team, is there, I mean, we see the sex trafficking with the labor trafficking and the labor trafficking injuries and victimization. It looks like a world without OSHA. Burns, inhalation injuries, immersions, I mean, poisonings, stuff that just should not happen in any remotely responsible workplace. Exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, etc. So this is, you're hurt, but especially the diminished capacity in terms of the trauma. And what this means then is that our victims can at times be so vulnerable in terms of information processing. One of the things that Nicole and I see is the effects of strangulation, not choking. You choke on a piece of pizza, you choke on a grape, you choke on food. I'm tired of this choking stuff. No, this is strangulation. When you go for the airway, and I will tell you that we see this, and our law enforcement partners see this all the time, that Johns, the men who purchase commercial sex, and pimps and perps and gang members, they will go for the airway. And in domestic violence perpetrators, rule number one, go for the airway. Our most primal instinct is to breathe. And what's number one threat? Cut off your air. You cut off air long enough, you can have all sorts of sequelae that flow from that, including brain damage, anoxic injury, processing issues, et cetera, et cetera. So all that can lead to diminished capacity, which means, again, we have to be paying attention, listening, and thinking about who we're talking to, how they're conveying, what information they're doing. And that makes Jesse Williams' job difficult when she rolls up on a scene and there's a victim there or victims, and maybe that victim isn't making sense at first. And so she's trauma informed. What she's going to do, she's going to take her time and slow down and see what's going on and piece together the upside down world of what that victim has survived. Another thing, nobody ever talks about 2.1 advisor, but I like this rule because here's the thing. I mean, we have an obligation as lawyers to look beyond just the rules of civil procedure, criminal procedure, statutes, et cetera. I mean, there's a whole world out there. And in this world, thinking about mental health and medical consequences. That's big. And that's something too, where then we are allowed to collaborate, and times we need to collaborate with professionals who can do this. Sometimes I do stuff up in Danville at Geisinger Medical Center, the level 1 trauma center in Danville. For 40 counties in Pennsylvania, that's the go-to place. If things are going sideways in 40 counties in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is a rectangle, this piece here from Danville and going up, I mean, if it's hit the fan, you're being life flighted in or brought in. Because Harrisburg and Hershey, that's way too far. You're dead by then. They have a trauma psychologist that works in the emergency department and the trauma ICU, specifically looking for a number of things, including this. And then pro bono, because at any point, we lawyers, while pro bono is a should rather than a shall, in my world, it should be a should. We have gifts. We need to give them. And the poor and the victims, they deserve. We didn't care. Quick stats. So, and we're very fortunate because Jesse and Carrie are going to do like a trafficking 101 lay of the land. But so what does 8317 mean? Okay, so the YWCA of Greater Harrisburg, this 13 county anti-trafficking project, we've been doing this for about 10 years. We've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of victims that we've worked with. 83% of the survivors we have worked with in human trafficking are US citizens. 17% are overseas nationals. There's a lot of mythology out there because whatever information you get about trafficking, do not get it from Facebook or the internet. Because no, don't go there. No. But that's the real life where we are. Philly, it's a bit more overseas national, but the point is this is a homegrown problem. It's a homegrown problem. In addition to overseas nationals, which means at times in our shelter, we have multiple languages, religions, faiths, cooking, I mean, everything, human beings coming together. And not one of them wants to be there. Understand? Because they are fleeing for their lives. 95. Okay, let's separate out the US citizen component of this. 95% of our trafficking survivors grew up in a home and survived domestic violence. 95% or more were sexually assaulted or raped in their home or around their home by the time their 12th birthday. I want to be very clear. So does that mean that if you survive domestic violence, you are going to be trafficked? And the answer is no. If you survive rape or sexual assault, are you going to be trafficked? The answer is no. But what does it say? Domestic violence, sexual assault, it's trauma. Trauma. And the more trauma that piles up on a human being that is not mitigated, that is not helped, that is not diminished, that doesn't end, and that cycles seemingly endlessly, the more vulnerable you are. And so why what keeps people from getting out of this? Addiction, trauma bonding, distrust of authority, criminal records, cultural release, on, and we're going to talk about this as we go through this, but it's not something where we'll just stop. The overwhelming number of victims we work with have a substance abuse addiction. Battling that is a lifelong battle, let alone then dealing with cumulative trauma. That's our hotline. That's the trafficking hotline. And what I'm going to do now is turn it over for a bit more law, real law, from our prosecutor.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Heather Castellino. I'm a prosecutor with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office. I've been there for almost 25 years, and as Attorney General Henry said, I work in her office. I am lucky to have the support of a prosecutor and a leader like her, and I want to thank her for the opportunity to grant us the resources and the time and the understanding to work the cases that we work. My portion of this CLE is probably the most dry, but important because we are here for a CLE. I'm going to talk about the Pennsylvania Human Trafficking Law. And I'm going to start just very briefly by talking just 2 slides worth of the federal trafficking law, because it was the first law addressing human trafficking in the United States, and most of the states, including Pennsylvania, have used that law that's referred to as the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, have jumped off of that and have some version of that now in their states. So 2 main points here. The TVPA equipped the US government with new tools and resources to mount a comprehensive and coordinated campaign to eliminate modern forms of slavery domestically and internationally. It also established the framework of the 3 Ps for the fight against human trafficking, which we'll hear again when I talk about the Pennsylvania law, but we talk about this a lot in the human trafficking world, is protection, prevention, and prosecution. So what does that mean? I put a couple bullet points here to just touch on some main points of what that means within the law. Protection, a good example of that is the way this act protects victims or survivors of human trafficking is it gives us a resource of 2 different types of visas that we could use for victims of both sex and labor trafficking, the T visa and the U visa. Which are ways that we can allow victims of trafficking to stay in the United States and not have to go back to a situation that caused them to be exposed to trafficking in the first place. Prevention, amongst other things, there's an office that is established to monitor tips for human trafficking, and I think also within that would be education, which is part of the prevention. And then prosecution is the actual laws and portions of the laws. Some of the most important things is it strengthened the penalties for certain crimes that had already been in existence, and it also modified some of the language to make it easier to work with. So I'm going to talk about the current Pennsylvania law, which was enacted. It's called Act 105. It was from July 2014. Prior to that, there was a law in the books in Pennsylvania that addressed human trafficking. It needed a lot of revision and needed a lot of refinements, which and it wasn't used much at all, probably just a handful of times, if that. So in 2014, we get Act 105, which clarifies things for us as prosecutors and law enforcement. And our law in Pennsylvania also references the 3 Ps: prevention, prosecution, and protection. The 2 main statutes that we use as prosecutors and law enforcement are Title 18, 3011, and Title 18, 3012. I'll talk about those in more detail, but those are the 2 main statutes that we charge and prosecute under. So Pennsylvania laws, usually in the crimes code, we have a section in the beginning that talks about certain important definitions that are not found somewhere else within Pennsylvania law. So the first one I have here, human trafficking is any activity in violation of 3011 or either alone or in conjunction with 3012. That's very lawyer-like. Hopefully I'll be able to make a little more sense of that as we go on. And then there's a definition for both labor and sexual servitude. Again, in and of themselves aren't super helpful until you get to the statutes. This is important later on, as you'll see. The definition of a minor for purposes of human trafficking is an individual less than 18 years of age. And serious harm has a specific definition, which becomes very important when we start to look at 3012. It's defined as any harm, whether physical or non-physical, that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances as the victim of human trafficking to perform or continue to perform labor or service, a commercial sex act, or performance involving sex acts in order to avoid incurring that harm. Well, in my opinion, the thing I would point to, again, that's a long, typical lawyer, very, very run-on sentence. But the thing that I would point to there is to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances. So when you hear these stories, I'm not going to go through and talk about what human trafficking is and isn't, and the myths. Jesse and Carrie will do that, and Steve will do that as well after I'm done. But when they're talking about those things, and when you see these things on the internet, think about a reasonable person. You're not talking about you with your education and your background. You're talking about a person in that situation, a reasonable person in that situation under the same circumstances. So the actual definition of trafficking in individuals, it's a felony of the 1st degree, which is the most serious crime grading we have in Pennsylvania. And this is the actual definition. So one either recruits, entices, solicits, advertises, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, or maintains an individual if the person knows or recklessly disregards that the individual will be subject to sexual servitude, or knowingly benefits financially or receives anything of value from any act that facilitates any activity described in paragraph 1. So an important note here too is sexual servitude of a minor occurs whenever any sexual conduct or performance involving sexual conduct of a minor, regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. So when people talk about, especially prosecutors, talk about human trafficking and what it is, you often hear force, fraud, or coercion are the three things that we focus on. Our statute in Pennsylvania doesn't specifically say you have to expose someone to force, fraud, and coercion, but we talk about the means in which you need to show that as a prosecutor or law enforcement to show that that crime occurred. At the bottom of this slide, it specifically says that if there's a commercial sex act, which is a lot of people know as prostitution, but especially this means any kind of sexual conduct in exchange for money. If someone is having someone else do that and that person is a minor, you don't need to show force, fraud, or coercion if that person's under 18. So I put this section here because it actually helped me when I was reading this statute for the first time. It's the comment to 3011 and 3012. And it's from when the Act 105 was put into effect in 2014. And I think this kind of breaks down what the legislature meant to do and does do in these particular sections. There's two separate statutes, which I laid out in the beginning, 3011 and 3012, which is trafficking of individuals and involuntary servitude. Both of them encompass human trafficking. So there's no specific law in Pennsylvania that says human trafficking is A, B, and C. It's these two specific statutes that overall encompass human trafficking. Involuntary servitude is broken down into two types: labor and sexual servitude. So if you look through the laws, you're not going to find something that specifically says you commit labor trafficking when you do this, or you commit sexual or sex trafficking when you do this. You have to read a little bit more closely. There's also something called debt coercion, which focuses on the exploitation of the debtor based on the existence of a debt. And I have highlighted here, it also includes those situations in which a trafficker has knowledge of a human trafficking victim's debt to a third party and uses that knowledge to coerce the services of a debtor. So an example of that would be if an individual comes into the country and has paid someone else to help them come in, and they owe a debt of, say, $100,000 for the assistance to come into the country. That individual who came into the country has to pay that debt off. If a third person steps in as the trafficker and takes advantage of the debt and forces that person to earn money in order to pay the person back in the foreign country or wherever they are that help the person come in, they're both guilty of trafficking. So under 3012, this is often called the means of subjecting an individual to involuntary servitude. So this is how what we have to do as law enforcement and prosecutors look to the facts of an individual case to see whether or not we can prove this particular crime has happened given a certain set of facts. I broke it down into, these aren't statutorial categories. The part that says force on top, I just broke it down to, because I think sections 1, 2, and 3 can be categorized that way, meaning there's 13 separate sections of involuntary servitude. The first 3, I think, directly relate to what we would consider force. The first is causing or threatening to cause serious harm to any individual. That's obviously very self-explanatory. Physically restraining or threatening to physically restrain another individual, or kidnapping or attempting to kidnap any individual. One note I'll say, and I always say this when I'm talking about the 13 separate subsections, is that I've prosecuted a number of human trafficking cases. I have seen and prosecuted traffickers for every single subsection under this statute 3012, except for kidnapping. So I like to just say that so you can keep in mind, because I think that's one of the things that people envision when they first think about human trafficking. So I'm sure that does happen. I just don't think it's quite as prevalent as the media and the internet would want us to think. So the next few sections I categorized as fraud. So subsection 4, abusing or threatening to abuse the legal process. An example of that would be a trafficker is aware that the victim is out on bail or is on parole. The trafficker, okay, thanks, Jesse. The trafficker could say, hey, listen, I know you're on bail or I know you're on parole. I'm going to report you to your parole officer if you don't do what I'm telling you to do. I'm gonna speed it up a little because I don't want to take too much time. 5 is pretty self-explanatory, taking somebody's personal property, engaging in wrongful conduct with respect to documents, taking somebody's passport or driver's license is very common, extortion, and then fraud. Coercion actually has a specific definition under 2906 of the Crimes Code. Any type of duress, debt coercion, facilitating or controlling the individual's access to a controlled substance. Steve already touched on this. This is very, very prevalent and very, very common, where a trafficker will control a victim through either supplying drugs to the victim or refusing to supply drugs to a victim, and having that particular individual going through withdrawal symptoms unless he or she does what the trafficker tells him to do. And then 13 is a more comprehensive subsection, using any scheme, plan, or action intended to cause the individual to believe that if the individual does not perform the labor, services, acts, or performances, the individual or another individual will suffer serious harm or physical restraint. One thing I'll point out to on this is that what I think is common, and what we've seen a lot, is that a trafficker will threaten the victim's family, their children, their brothers, their sisters, their parents, not just them. This slide I thought was important to put in right after we heard about the means, because it specifically allows for expert testimony in criminal proceedings. In my job, it has become very helpful and important to have an expert testify in court, not only because most people don't understand why somebody in a certain situation, why a victim just doesn't leave. I hear that over and over again. Well, why didn't she just leave? She wasn't chained to a radiator. She wasn't tied down. She wasn't locked in the room. We need experts to explain that. And this law, I think it's only a couple of years old, 2 years old, now allows for us to utilize an expert in human trafficking cases. This talks about the qualifications for an expert, which basically just boils down to the fact that an expert has to have specialized training and knowledge. There's no specific education or training, but they just need to be, that needs to be outlined to the judge, and the judge will make a determination whether that person's qualified. And then the expert does not testify to the specifics of that individual's victimization. The expert will just testify to his or her knowledge about trafficking in general. So it'll be the types of things that Steve has said, Nicole has said, and Jesse and Carrie will say, but it won't relate to that specific individual. This is the portion of the statute that holds the buyer of commercial sex responsible. And you'll see here that this particular, these particular subsections say that if that person, the buyer, who you often refer to in common language as the John, knows or has reckless disregard that the person he or she is buying sex from is being trafficked, it is a serious crime, either a felony of the 1st degree or 3rd degree. This is the evidence and defenses to human trafficking. I wanted to point out a relatively new portion of the statute. 2 years ago, the legislature added a specific provision, which is A1, that says that basically applies what we call the rape shield law to trafficking cases, meaning under 3104 in Title 18, specific instances of the victim's past sexual conduct are not admissible. Meaning, if we're presenting a victim to a judge or a jury, the defense attorney can't come in and say, you know, aside from when you were being trafficked, you know, how many people have you slept with in the past? Have you ever done this for yourself? You can't ask specific, it's not relevant to whether that particular person is being victimized by that trafficker. So this, I think, kind of ties into some of our ethical obligations as prosecutors and law enforcement. This is part of the protection key under the statute. We cannot disclose the name of a victim of human trafficking unless it's ordered by the court. So that means even when we're filing documents initially with the court, charging documents and like search warrants, anything, we have to make sure that the names of the victims are not revealed in those documents. Section 3020 allows for restitution to the victim. I think this is somewhat underutilized and we're trying to use it more and more. And the statute has been amended to allow for greater restitution to the victims. And you can see here that basically what the statute is designed to do is to get the victim the money that he or she should have been paid by the trafficker in either sex or labor trafficking. This just talks about some additional protections for the victims through diversionary programs and affirmative defenses. So vacatur is something that I think is important, not just for prosecutors to be aware of, but also for specifically for defense attorneys. This is a portion of the statute that allows a victim to ask the court to have his or her prior convictions vacated or expunged. And basically what the law says is that if you were required to commit those crimes because you were being trafficked, you really should never have been convicted of them in the first place. So why do we do that? The dynamics that lead women to enter and remain in the life, which is a term used for trafficking, include violence, trauma, substance use, and poverty. And you can just, common sense tells you that a lot of times those things lead people to commit thefts, drug-related offenses, and other crimes. And then once someone has a criminal record, it's very hard for them to get far in life. It creates problems for employment, for education, for housing. Currently, and I know there's a movement to expand some of the crimes that are subject to vacatur, but currently these are the crimes for which someone could seek vacatur because of them being victimized through trafficking. It's prostitution, criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, loitering, obstructing highways and other public passages, and simple possession of a controlled substance. These are the requirements of what someone needs to do to get their convictions vacated. And you can see it's not a really easy and straightforward process. There are people that can help victims through this process. And I'd encourage anyone who in the legal profession that's so inclined to do that, that would be very good pro bono work. That's a form of pro bono work, like Steve mentioned. So I'll end it there. Sorry I went through that so quick. I just wanted to make sure I'm getting a high sign from the back. I want to make sure I got everything in. So thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear? Yeah. Thank you, Heather. And you know, I mean, what you heard running through there, what Heather talking about too, is that we could do a CLE just on heightened ethical obligations of prosecutors. Because when I was a prosecutor, you're a prosecutor. I mean, we have certain ethical burdens that defense lawyers criminal defense lawyers do not have. And at times it means, for example, dismissing charges, dismissing cases. I mean, you know, this is not just about winning or whatever. I mean, you have a heightened sense and ethics of obligation. And including that also means too, not standing in the way of a vacatur where if somebody was trafficked and was forced to, in fact, we were just talking about this, Jesse, about, having to do retail thefts, holding drugs, doing, simple sales of drugs, which, is beyond the scope of that at this point. But there's all sorts of lower level crimes that victims are obligated to do, literally at times under threat of gun or under threat of a family member. This is a piece of vicarious trauma. She, when she left, and this happens a lot. The drugs clawed her back, street life called her back, the upside down of what that reality was. She called her hotline a couple times. There was an advocate there for a while, Tanya. Tanya and I worked with her, and Chloe she called a couple looking for Tanya and me, and we weren't there. I mean, I was probably at the hospital with Nicole, or I was doing something like this, or on the street, or whatever. And then about 2 months later, I picked up the hotline, and it was her. And she said, "Are you mad at me?" I said, "No. I'm so glad you're alive." And she said, "It's really bad out here. Can I come home?" I mean, you saw our shelter. It's safe from the outside, but it's not the Four Seasons. It's communal living with people that are just drowning in trauma. But she came back. She stayed with us for about a week. But one of the things that she said, "You know what? I told all the girls I was with, and it was bad, worse than before, that you guys didn't call me an effing whore, an effing slut, an effing skank. The troopers didn't say that to me. The nurses didn't say that to me. You just brought me in." Because life is ugly out there. And then she left again. And 6 months later, she came back 5 months pregnant. At this time, she was using meth and heroin. And she stayed for 2 weeks, and then she's been in the wind. So why did I tell you this? Because Jesse and Carrie are going to explain this. Because Heather laid the groundwork for this. Because this is the world of forensic nursing. It's a real world. But what she said was, we were safe to go to. Not perfect, but safe. And maybe that's, at times, that's all we can do until she or he is ready to stay. And when they're ready to stay, they fly. They do wonderfully. But you've got to be ready. And we've got to try and do everything we can to get them ready. Okay. Now let's do the dynamic duo. Harry and Jesse.
always tough following that. So, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Again, my name is Carrie Dwyer and I'm an intelligence analyst at the Pennsylvania State Police. I specifically work in the Pennsylvania Criminal Intelligence Center. So we are Pennsylvania's main fusion center. So I work very closely with our troopers assigned to the organized crime unit, but I also assist other state agencies on trafficking investigations, as well as local officers and federal officers as well. So this is what the universal standard definition of what human trafficking is. It's a form of modern day slavery in which a trafficker uses the force, fraud, and coercion that Heather has talked about to control victims for the purposes of engaging in commercial sex acts and labor services against his or her will. And it's estimated that there's over 20 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. So when we talk human trafficking, there's actually 3 different types. The first is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So children under the age of 18 who are induced into commercial sex acts with or without the use of force, fraud, and coercion. The second is sex trafficking. So adults 18 or older who are induced into commercial sex through that use of force, fraud, and coercion. And the third, labor trafficking. So children and adults who are induced to perform labor services against his or her will. And Heather already mentioned earlier that the differences between the commercial sexual exploitation of children and sex trafficking is that with the sexual exploitation of children, you don't have to show the elements of force, fraud, and coercion. Because they're a child under the age of 18, they cannot consent to commercial sex, so it automatically falls under human trafficking. So who can be a victim of human trafficking? I mean, anyone and everyone, anyone in this room, your friends, family members, there's no, one set standard as what a victim could look like. And there's no specific age, race, gender, they could be homeless living out in the streets, or they could come from a very nice middle-class family. Human trafficking does not, discriminate. It's estimated that every 30 seconds, another person becomes victim of human trafficking. About 100,000 children in the US are victims of human trafficking, but I would anticipate that is probably a pretty low number than we're aware of. And some of these victims can be as young as 4 years old. I was watching a webinar one time, and she was a human trafficking survivor, and she was trafficked starting at the age of 4 years old by family members. So I know Heather touched on the force, fraud, and coercion a bit, so I'm just gonna kind of breeze through these a little bit just for the sake of time. So with sex trafficking, what are those elements of force, fraud, and coercion gonna look like? So they're gonna induce or exploit a substance abuse issue. Not every single victim already has a drug addiction, but sometimes they'll eventually develop one because they're being forced to take heroin or being forced to take pills by the trafficker to be able to get them to comply with their demands and control their movements. There's, again, that physical and constant sexual abuse. So they'll be raped by the traffickers, they're raped by the Johns, they're constantly beat by the Johns, where the traffickers, just constant physical and threats of physical violence. They're going to intimidate them using weapons. So they'll have a gun to their head, a knife to their throat. They'll constantly, have a gun in their waistband and, showing it to them. If you don't do what I say, what's going to happen to you. And emotional abuse, especially if that victim has a young child. If you don't bring $1,500 home by the end of tonight, you're going to find your daughter out on the streets. With labor trafficking, they're going to withhold their pay, constant threats to harm them or their families back home. If the victim has come from a foreign country, they'll, say, hey, here's your home address. If you don't, comply with our demands, we're going to send somebody to your house to take care of your family. The constant excessive working hours, threaten to report them to immigration, that physical abuse as well with labor trafficking victims, high pressure coercive tactics, verbal abuse, they'll use slurs against whatever their ethnicity is, and withhold or deny any essential needs. So again, like Steve said, they're constantly working 17 some hours a day. If it's 100 degrees outside and they're on working at a farm, there's not going to be any protection from the sun. They're not going to get food breaks, water breaks. If they get injured, maybe they will go to the hospital, maybe they won't. So just that constant, just physical abuse. So everyone, a lot of people think that human trafficking is not occurring in the United States. But the reality is, it's definitely here in Pennsylvania. We're constantly working on new cases. Every time we turn around, there's, a new tip coming in about human trafficking. It's a $150 billion industry worldwide. 9.8 billion comes from the United States alone. Some statistics, so from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, in 2021, there were 51,073 signals made to that hotline. So signals meaning calls, texts, online chats, and tips. And of all those signals, there were 10,360 cases of actual human trafficking that were identified. So for Pennsylvania specifically, to that hotline, there were 1,080 signals regarding Pennsylvania specific cases. And then of those 1,080, there were 192 cases of trafficking actually identified. And then to break it down further, 153 were sex trafficking, 18 were labor, 8 were both sex and labor trafficking, and 13 were unknown. This is just a heat map just giving an idea of where the hotspots in the United States are. So you can still kind of make out the word Pennsylvania. I would say we're probably about 60% covered, but I would, think that it would be a little bit more covered. I think this one's from 2021. So we'll see by the end of this year for the 2022 statistics and heat map to see, how much it'll differ from year to year. But definitely our hotspots would be like in the Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Lancaster, Carlisle, Harrisburg, New Cumberland are the main areas in PA that we would consider to be our hotspots. So when we teach on human trafficking to law enforcement, we always talk about the 3 R's. So that would be recognize the indicators. If they're investigating a retail theft or a drug investigation, what additional indicators are present in that investigation that they should be thinking about whether there's a tie to human trafficking. So rethink that situation in order to respond appropriately and refer for investigation or additional resources. So everyone's obviously lawyers or soon to be lawyers. So, recognize those indicators in a case that you might be handling with a new client. What indicators, potential indicators of human trafficking are you seeing with that new client? Just another graphic that we show with our law enforcement presentations as to how both labor and trafficking and sex trafficking can be found in different types of investigations. So gangs, Jesse might mention this as well, but gangs are turning to human trafficking versus drug trafficking because it's a lot easier to get away with. Child abuse cases, what else is present in that child abuse case? Domestic violence. So if there's an assault in a hotel room between, a supposed boyfriend and girlfriend, what other indicators are present in that situation? Is it, the trafficker, beating one of his victims? So law enforcement has to be prepared to notify or notice those indicators in each and every case that they're investigating. So where are traffickers finding their victims? So in person, they're going to go to rehab centers. They want to find somebody, they want those vulnerable victims, where, vulnerable victims can be found in rehab centers. Somebody who wants to get clean and build a better life for themselves. But trafficker just, wants to go swoop on in and find, whomever is probably the most susceptible to becoming a victim of human trafficking. Bus stations, they'll look for runaway juveniles. They'll look for somebody who is homeless and sleeping outside of that bus station. Bars and clubs, if a group of girlfriends is out and about at the clubs, they're going to look for the girl who's kind of more, might seem more a little naive, a little more shy, might seem a little insecure, unsure of herself. They want to look for that person versus, the one who's, super, engaging and outgoing. Schools, and then teen safe homes and group homes. Maybe they're gonna hang outside those group homes and find somebody that they might want to give a ride to. The internet, so all the social media sites, which I'll show a slide next. So Facebook, Instagram, all the dating applications, online gaming platforms, especially obviously for juveniles, and then commercial sex ads and escort sites. They'll target those who are already engaging in the commercial sex. But the reality is it's anywhere. traffickers will find their victims anywhere. So for runaways, so 2.8 million children run away each year, and within 48 hours, they'll be approached by a trafficker. You know, again, you know, whether it's like a bus station or maybe they're kind of, you know, couch surfing, you know, friend, you know, a friend of a friend of a friend, and eventually, you know, they end up at the wrong house and they'll be approached by a trafficker there. So those who run away 3 or more times are 78% more likely to end up being trafficked. So I know Heather talked about the kidnapping. You know, a lot of people kind of think kidnapping and human trafficking go hand in hand, but the reality is it just doesn't happen that way. Everybody thinks of the movie Taken. You know, the wealthy, beautiful blonde girl from a wealthy family gets kidnapped from the home and is being sex trafficked in another country. But I mean, the reality is that's not what we are seeing in any of our cases. That's not, you know, what happens. And then the targeting your car in a Walmart or Target parking lot. This is constantly being shared on social media, that if you come out to your car and you have like a zip tie on your handle or like tally marks on your back window, that your car and you and your family have been targeted for human trafficking. That's not what human trafficking looks like at all. That's just the constant misinformation, disinformation that is just always shared on social media. And the other type is selling children on furniture websites. This is another thing that is constantly being shared on social media. I don't know if anybody heard of the Wayfair scandal at all. Anybody? Yeah, for everyone online, everyone in their head or in the room is nodding their head yes. So if you don't know what it was widely being shared on like Facebook, Instagram, that if you purchase this $13,000 cabinet that just so happened to be named after a missing child, that you were purchasing that cabinet and you're actually purchasing that missing child for the purposes of sex trafficking them. That's just something that one of the widely known conspiracy theory group has shared all over social media. It was just kind of their way of getting attention and putting their own spin on what human trafficking was. So social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Kik, Plenty of Fish, OkCupid, and Tinder were the most commonly reported social media sites and dating applications reported by victims that they had been approached on by their trafficker. So for 2020, online recruitment by traffickers increased by 22%. That probably shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody because started the pandemic, everybody went online, but so did the traffickers. So there was 125% increase on Facebook and a 95% increase on Instagram. And that's for both sex and labor trafficking. A lot of labor traffickers will post like false job advertisements, you know, make quick cash, you know, those types of things all over Instagram and Facebook. So it's not just sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is found all over social media as well. So why are traffickers going online? I mean, it's a lot easier to, you know, approach victims, find victims. We all know somebody who overshares on social media, right? You know, somebody who goes through a breakup, somebody who, you know, didn't do well in a class, somebody who, you know, didn't make this, you know, sports team that they wanted. You know, everybody overshares. But those are the types of people that a trafficker wants to look out for. They want to look for the vulnerable person, the person that they can kind of swoop on in and, you know, be that listening ear, that shoulder to cry on. But that's kind of where that grooming process will eventually start. So, you know, they'll initiate friend requests, follow their pages, look at every post that they're posting. What are they, you know, sharing, resharing? Are they mentioning, you know, activities that they like to do, certain sports teams in the little graphic that's on the screen? So that was one from a victim who that was, you know, how the initial conversation with the trafficker started. You know, she posted a story, I guess, about a guy in a breakup. So he kind of, you know, swooped on in and started that initial conversation. And she talks about her daughter. So there's, you know, that vulnerability right there. That's single mother. You know, she must, you know, post about being a vegan. So he's, you know, uses that as a way to kind of latch on her and create that conversation, you know, and she asked him, you know, are you vegan too? And he's like, yeah, of course I am. but is he actually vegan? Probably not. But again, that's just a way that, you know, he just wants to build that trust and start that conversation. And eventually, you know, just take things further than just an online chat. I'm just going to touch on labor trafficking for a bit, and then once I'm done, Jesse will pick up with sex trafficking. So general awareness does remain a barrier. We don't, when it comes to getting tips and fielding tips that come in, we don't get as many about labor trafficking as we do about sex trafficking. You know, it doesn't mean it's not happening. We know it's happening everywhere, but it just doesn't get reported as often. So for that hotline, there were, again, the 1,066 labor trafficking cases. And of those, there were only 18 labor trafficking cases for Pennsylvania. So, you know, there's got to be a lot more than 18 happening in Pennsylvania. But, you know, it's just getting those victims to come forward, getting them comfortable to talking to law enforcement, getting them comfortable to talking to someone in, you know, at the ER, like Nicole, or someone like Steve, you know, just getting them to open up and tell them, you know, what's happening. So the most common industries where labor trafficking, the agriculture industry, so they're out again working on those farms, in the home, so you know, au pairs, nannies, housekeepers, health and beauty services, so nail salons and massage parlors, restaurant industry, and just other small businesses. And there was a 70% increase with labor trafficking in the agriculture industry at the start of the pandemic. Again, that really shouldn't be as a surprise because, you know, hotels and restaurants were operating at full capacity at that time. So all those, you know, victims had to be, you know, funneled elsewhere, and they had to go all into the agriculture industry because, you know, they weren't closing down. So, you know, they, those traffickers were able to kind of sell them to a different industry. Some common indicators. And then again, with labor trafficking, anyone can be a victim. So whether it's, you know, men, women, children, foreign nationals, or, you know, US citizen, there's no, you know, one set standard as what a labor trafficking victim can look like. I was doing a presentation like a month ago out in Clarion, Pennsylvania, and there was a woman who worked as like a legal advocate, and she got up and spoke at the end of the presentation to talk about her story. She had adopted 6 brothers. They were all, you know, obviously different age ranges, but in the prior foster home that they were living in, they're actually being labor trafficked. They were working at a family farm. They were being, you know, labor trafficked on the farm and forced to sleep in like closets. They were forced to eat like, you know, like Spam out of the cans, like just completely unhealthy, just expired foods, and they were just treated absolutely horribly. But fortunately, you know, the traffickers, the 2 foster parents, you know, were convicted of labor trafficking of those boys, and you know, they ended up in a very nice home. You know, some of them are, you know, struggling, but some of them are doing incredibly well for themselves. So the indicators of what trafficking is going to look like, they're going to be pressured by an employer to stay in a job or a situation that they don't want to stay in. They might owe money to an employer, or they weren't being paid what they were promised. They're not going to have access to legal documents, to their passports or other identifications. So they're just going to basically be trapped or wherever they're at. Living and working in isolated, inhumane conditions. I think a lot of like big labor trafficking cases that I've researched, like there's been a couple big ones out in Ohio, like these individuals are forced to live and sleep in like dilapidated trailers with like 15 other people that doesn't have, like, you know, can't even open the windows, there's no air conditioning, there's no heat, they're just living in these just terrible conditions that, you know, normally wouldn't, nobody in this room would, you know, want anybody to sleep there. Just monitored by another person when talking. There's constantly, you know, traffickers constantly going to be worried that they're going to either run off the farm and talk to law enforcement. So they kind of just want to monitor those conversations. And again, just working in dangerous conditions without proper safety gear, training, breaks, or other protections. Just some more like specific examples of the forced fraud and coercion with labor trafficking. So again, that physical abuse, they're going to get hit a victim was hit in the back of the head, glass has been thrown at victims to get them to comply, or if they did something that upset the trafficker. Psychological abuse with those victims, labor trafficking and sex trafficking, but so if we killed you, who would know? A lot of labor trafficking victims might come from another country. Who back home is going to know that anything has happened to you here? Nobody's going to know where to look for you. Somebody's been verbally abused in front of neighbors just for wasting a paper towel. Again, just not eating properly, so meals twice a day, just instant noodles, no medical care during 16 months of being trafficked, and just that constant hard work on their bodies, working hot days, cold nights, and without getting any protection. And one victim, their first paycheck was less than $200. Sometimes they're going to be promised, you'll make $1,500 a week and you won't have to pay for anything. Food, housing, all that stuff is free of charge, but the reality is that's just complete nonsense. So this victim, their first paycheck was less than $200 after having to be forced to pay for passport fees and other legal fees that they were told they didn't have to pay. And they were working 60 to 70-hour weeks, even though their timesheets were marked 40. So making less than $500. I mean, probably can't even go to the grocery store without walking out with $200-300 bill at this point. So they're just not making the money that they were promised. So, switching to sex trafficking.
Hi, my name is Jessica Williams. I'm a trooper with the Pennsylvania State Police. I work out of the organized crime unit in the Northeast. I'm also the human trafficking coordinator for the eastern side of the state. So switching gears a little bit, like Carrie said, what we're seeing in Pennsylvania, obviously we have a pretty bad opioid and methamphetamine epidemic. It's caused a lot of people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, engage in activity that they normally wouldn't engage in. As well as the COVID-19 pandemic, that's changed everything in this world, like economically, socioeconomically. We've seen people lose their homes, lose their jobs. So there's a lot of people that are willing to do things also that they normally wouldn't consider doing. Because of that, we're seeing a decreased protection measure and resources for survivors and for victims. We don't have certain shelters. Some rehabs have closed their doors. So there's not a lot of places for people to go now. And then also we're seeing a big transition from gangs with their normal criminal activity and into human trafficking. They're seeing that it's a lot more profit and a lot less risk. So sex trafficking is the commercial, the definition is the commercial sex act that's induced by force, fraud, or coercion. This is the fastest growing crime in the United States. It's second to drug trafficking. Like Carrie had said, I believe it's a $150 billion a year industry trafficking worldwide. 9.8 of that is coming from the United States. Out of that 9.8, 60% of that is solely derived from sex trafficking alone. So the example that I always like to use is, especially for the gangs, when people don't understand why they would see less profit, more profit, less risk when it comes to sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is very easy to hide from law enforcement. And the example I always like to use is driving in the car with a kilo of cocaine is illegal. If you get pulled over by a cop or a police officer, you're going to be nervous because you know that that's in the back of your car. So just knowing that that's in the back of your car, you might notice some indicators. Somebody might be shaking, they might be nervous, they might not have their story straight, but it's not illegal to have a person in the vehicle with you. So it's very easy and very calm for them to get around that situation, especially somebody that they can control so easily. So it's easy to hide from law enforcement, whereas being in possession of the drug is a crime alone. Also, when it comes to sex trafficking, you have a reusable resource. With drugs, it's an expendable resource. You're dropping it off and then you have to re-up. With a human being, you don't have to do that. You can constantly use that person over and over and over again. As well, they're always looking for the next victim when it comes to sex trafficking, and you can find that, like Carrie said, absolutely anywhere. With drugs, you're going to need to buy more product and you go to specific people. The profit for drugs is always controlled by the suppliers, whereas profit for sex trafficking is controlled by the trafficker himself or herself. They can control the price, they can set the price for anything that they want. It doesn't matter. Internet also acts as a worldwide marketplace. They can virtually sell sex. You can buy sex anywhere. Whereas drug trafficking, it's sold mainly to personal contacts, people that they know are going to take the drug, that they know aren't law enforcement, etc. So this is a very lucrative business. Why are gangs thinking about getting involved in this? Why do traffickers do this? This is a very conservative example. Say you have one day, 2 victims, they're charging $100 per client and they have 5 clients each. It's about $1,000. They're not spending a lot of money on upkeep when it comes to their victims. They're not taking care of them. This isn't like Pretty Woman. And I always say that because that's not this. Maybe $15 on food. Sometimes they're gonna get them a cheap hotel room where they have breakfast included. And that might be the only thing that their victim's eating all day. $10 on condoms, possibly, maybe. It depends on the type of trafficker. Sometimes they don't care. Very cheap hotel rooms. So that's $125 coming out of their pocket. You can see the profit for the day, the week, the month, and the year. This is so conservative though, because we're seeing 1 to 2 traffickers that are controlling about 10 to 15 to 20 different victims, and they're not charging $100 per client. I know the cases that I investigate up in the Northeast, they're charging $300 to $400 per client up there. So that's what we're talking about, this being very conservative. So when I teach to law enforcement, I always hear the term, and we say commercial sex. A lot of times law enforcement will use the term prostitution. They use prostitution, commercial sex, and sex trafficking all synonymously. They're 2 completely different things. So prostitution is illegal in the state of Pennsylvania. Even though that is true, there are people that do engage in commercial sex of their own free will. It is a choice to do that. They are free to leave when it comes to that. They can make the decisions regarding when, where, how, who they engage in commercial sex with, and they have control over all their money. When it comes to sex trafficking, even if it started off as a choice, like Carrie had said, a lot of times they will go to, traffickers do target escort websites, and they will target people that are already engaging in commercial sex. Just because they did engage in commercial sex previously doesn't mean that they chose this lifestyle now, that they're in the life of sex trafficking. They're not free to leave, and they don't have the decisions regarding who, when, where, why, how, and they don't have control or access to most of their earnings. So those are the major differences between commercial sex and actual sex trafficking. So law enforcement, where are our police and troopers? Where are they coming into contact with victims of trafficking? It's everywhere. It's on every call. I always tell everybody to look past what you're responding to. Look past your basic traffic stop. You know, when you're pulling people over for speeding, if you see, 2 people in the car, the interaction is a little odd. You're searching the car possibly for drugs. You get a consent search. You're looking in bags and you find lingerie and just sex toys in a bag. That's very odd, especially if it's not coming with a good story behind it. So this is what we're teaching troopers. Domestic incidences, disturbances, welfare checks, missing person. Carrie went through the statistics regarding runaways, controlled substance addictions, arrests. When you're pulling arrests for records and stuff, and we see drugs, prostitution, thefts, these types of things on records, they very much coincide with sex trafficking victims and also suicide attempts. And who are we coming into contact with? We're coming into contact with victims themselves, also the traffickers, the commercial sex buyers, which sometimes are always in the presence of a victim, witnesses, and those being the hotel workers, the taxi drivers, the store employees, restaurant workers, and just bystanders that are passing by and through. So victims of trauma, they have these victims, they have like susceptibilities, and it makes them very susceptible, to the traffickers. And it starts off as children, they turn into adults, and they still have these traumas that are attached to them. I had just heard it the other day, I believe the age that trauma sticks with you the most is between newborn to 5 years of age. So when you're going through something at that very young of an age, it actually is starting to stick at that age. And it goes into you for with the rest of your life. So we have children that have parents that could possibly be addicted to drugs or alcohol. Children that come from a psychologically or sexually abusive home or even physically abusive home. If their health and safety have been affected by poverty, violence, lack of access to education. Children that are in foster care and runaways. Gangs are taking their own steps into this, especially with foster care. They're starting to put people that are in their gangs into the foster care system and directly recruit people from the foster care system. So we have a very broken system. And then these children eventually turn into adults, and the adults become drug addicted themselves, or they become drug addicted themselves. They might not have strong family ties or support system around them. They can become financially unstable, and also the mentally disabled is a very big. Okay, so some indicators that we have here, these are going to be sudden changes in appearance or behavior, signs of malnourishment or exhaustion, poor hygiene, dental neglect, chronically running away from the home. If they have secret cell phones or multiple cell phones, some applications that generate multiple cell phone numbers, especially if they have like different applications on there like Text Now or Telegram or Signal, things that can hide their conversations. Tattoos, sometimes they have them, their traffickers do brand them. If they have overly explicit photos, I always say photos in various stages of undress. If you see those on phone, that's an indication. References to traveling and also being unaware of where they're currently at. Lack of knowledge as to travel plans. Unexplained absences from schools or activities, and close association with an overly controlling adult. And signs of current physical abuse is also an indicator. So for minors, especially if they lie about their age or their identity, lack of eye contact with law enforcement, that's a big one. Allowing others to speak for them, looking to others before answering questions, disoriented, like I said, lack of knowledge as to travel plans. There was a case up in the Northeast that we worked. The individual had absolutely no idea that they were even in Pennsylvania. So they thought that they were still in a completely different state. Having few or no personal possessions, like I explained, especially if people are traveling and they say that they're traveling from New York and they're going to Georgia, and we're searching vehicles, and in those vehicles, if we find just lingerie, I don't know anybody, or especially any woman at least, that travels with just those belongings. So that's definitely an indicator. Having and being not in control of your own finances, so not having a lot of money on you, or not even having anything on you, no credit cards, no IDs or anything like that. These are just some examples of some tattoos and branding, like I explained what traffickers can tend to put on their victims. If you can see like this money bag behind the ear, that means that she is a high earner for the trafficker. Also, anything that would indicate belonging to somebody. Daddy's girl, property of, names that are tattooed on people. I always tell people, especially with minors, when you're looking at minors or when you're talking to minors, if they have names that are tattooed on them, ask them about those tattoos, where they got them, who the person is behind the tattoo, because it's just something that's not very common to have a name tattooed on you, especially at such a young age. Anything that would show, especially like the DLA with the crown, they're the initials of the trafficker with the crown sitting on top of it, meaning that that person is their pimp, their king, their daddy. That's the person that's in charge of them. So what kind of barriers do we have? Self-identification by victims is very limited. They rarely ever see themselves as victims and have significant mistrust of law enforcement. I don't ever have victims through interviews turn and sit down and just tell me like, I'm a victim of human trafficking. It's so rare that it actually comes out. There's so much that goes into it in multiple interviews with the victim to actually get them to understand what's even happening. One of the best ways that we can always explain it to them is the difference between cooperation and consent. Being able to consent to something is very different than feeling like you have to cooperate with something. So it is something that we can explain to them that they do seem to grasp the understanding for that. The victims will almost never tell you the whole story the first time, and that can be mistaken for lying. We do teach this a lot to our troopers because a lot of times I think people just think people are not telling them the truth because you're law enforcement, they don't want to tell you what's going on. When it comes to victims of trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, they know that they are, it's drilled into their brain from the beginning, that they're the ones that are committing the crime. The trafficker's not doing anything. They're the ones engaging in prostitution. They're the ones that are stealing things for the trafficker or doing this for the trafficker. So they're the ones that are going to get caught. They're going to jail and they're going to get in trouble. And that's what's in their brain. So a lot of times they're not honest, like the first or second or third time, even during interviews. So we always try to get that minimal facts interview first, and then we build a rapport and a relationship with the victim so that we can get the full story. And also psychological trauma is very common, like everybody's been explaining. A lot of victims suffer from PTSD and Stockholm syndrome. Many victims have intimate relationships with their traffickers. So in an effort to make sure that we can build a good rapport when it comes to interviewing and speaking with victims and identifying victims, we want to make sure that we're not having any kind of negative talk or standoffish talk regarding the trafficker. Sitting down and talking like, you know, who's your pimp or who do you work for? Sometimes that doesn't go very far because then they think that the trafficker is going to get in trouble and they don't want to talk to anybody. They can completely shut down. Victims usually always fear retribution from their traffickers. If they don't work, if they don't make enough money, like Carrie had said, you know, if they don't bring in their quota, they might find their daughter out in the street. If they cooperate with police in any way, victims usually are programmed to believe that cooperating with police is always going to end in violence for them. So what do? We build that trust and rapport with the victims, and that's what we teach with the Safe Police. It's a very like victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. Now, when we deal with the different cases, because trafficking is all over and it's in every type of case. So we teach our troopers to go out and have that victim-centered, trauma-informed approach to the cases so that we can build rapport with potential victims. So that interaction is like the most important for us. When we treat the victim with respect, it can make the victim more cooperative. And it can also help with better recollection, because a lot of times they have so much trauma and drug addictions, they can't recall times, dates, locations, and it's split up. They might tell you something that they think happened a week ago, and that actually happened a month ago. And things that they think happened a month ago happened a couple of days ago. It's just how their brain works because of all of the trauma. So by even just asking, hey, do you mind if I write this down? I'm just going to take some notes just for myself. It might be the first time somebody asks them for permission for anything, and it might be something that they can actually automatically open up to you about. So trust and rapport is built over a long time. Sometimes it could take a lot of different interviews. Sometimes I've interviewed people twice and they've opened up right away. And then sometimes it's taken me years and years to interview the same person and they still haven't opened up. So this is the tip line. This goes directly to Carrie and all the human trafficking tips. So like what we have here, you recognize, report, and then we have rescue there. There's also that app that sees something, sends something app. You can report a tip that way. And that's all I have.
We're gonna get Nicole up now, but I just want to say thank you guys so much because, and you know, the theme that's running through here, and Nicole's gonna talk about it too, and Jesse talked about it, is it's very rare that you get a disclosure right away. It takes a huge amount of work and time and patience and trust in building a relationship when people have just been betrayed by one human being after another and violently. Now we got our nurse.
Hi, my name is Nicole Basil. I'm the unit director of the forensic nursing program at UPMC. Some of you is going to encounter victims of human trafficking, whether it's in your professional career or personal. Some of those victims might need medical evaluation. That's when the forensic nurses are contacted and we get involved. So I kind of just want to provide an overview of what our program is and just in the public. I know a lot of people aren't aware that we even exist. So you might hear the word SANE, SAFE, and FNE. SANE is sexual assault nurse examiner, SAFE is sexual assault forensic exam, and then FNE is forensic nurse examiner. Forensic nurse examiner is more of that broad term because we see more than just sexual assault patients. We're registered nurses, but we have that specialized education and clinical training to care for these patients who report any type of sexual, emotional, or physical violence. We're trauma-informed, victim-centered care. We provide these medical forensic exams related to crime. It's actually where that practice of nursing, when we get that health field and that legal system, and we kind of intersect those two. Along with all of that, we work close with district attorneys, law enforcement. We have to know the Pennsylvania laws, how to protect our patients, how to advocate for our patients, and when to report certain crimes. So our program, we're a like Steve kind of mentioned at the beginning, we're a 24/7 program. We're available at 7 UPMC hospital sites within the central PA unit, central PA area. We're actually the only mobile unit in this area. We're full-time forensic nurses, so this is our main job. We don't work in another department like the emergency room, and we pick up extra shifts. This is our full-time job. We do a lot of research, studying to become the experts in this field to care for our patients. We are involved in 4 different counties in the area. So each county has like separate roles. So we have to be aware, again, how to advocate for our patients and how to care for those patients. So our services, like I said, we're forensic nurses. So we care for patients more than just sexual assault. So that includes all ages, pediatric, adolescent, adults, any gender, child abuse, physical and sexual abuse. We are involved in domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Mainly we do consults on those. We're not going to do any forensic collection on those type of patients. Non-fatal strangulation. Steve mentioned at the beginning how serious those crimes are. So we've been working with Dauphin County and Cumberland County DAs to kind of utilize the forensic nurses in that evidence collection to possible get like that touch DNA. So when that hand is around that throat, blocking that airway. Research, it's not a lot of research, but there has been some research to show that can possibly get that perpetrator's DNA. Of course, the human trafficking. We also see elder sexual abuse, and then we also do suspects exams. That is through a subpoena only. The patient, they're still our patient. We really want them to consent, but as law enforcement will bring that suspect in for evidence collection, our patients do not have to consent. We don't get many, through all the years I've been doing this, maybe 4 patients that were suspects that law enforcement brought in for me to collect evidence, and the patient consented. I would just think it would look bad if they didn't consent to that evidence collection. And of course, we do a lot of community outreach training on our forensic nursing services and of course our program. So I'm going to kind of skip this. This is the repeat. I just feel like this would be like an introduction of human trafficking. The human trafficking in healthcare. 88% of trafficking survivors have been in contact with a healthcare provider during their captivity. 63% of those survivors reported they were seen in the emergency department. We give a lot of education to the emergency departments, how to recognize those signs, symptoms, and indicators. Warning signs. I know Jessica mentioned a lot of these. I really want to point out, if somebody would present to the emergency department for any abuse, and we educate that staff to notice these warning signs, these indicators, bald patches from maybe pulling, the trafficker pulling the victim's hair. I want to point out the no identification, lack of insurance. Jessica mentioned about not really knowing where they're at. We know we're in Harrisburg. I might not know the date or the time, but we know where we're at. Some traffic victims might not know what city, state they're in. We really pay attention to that history of events, why they're here, how did they get that injury? Does the injuries match what they're reporting to us? So we really pay attention to that with everything else that Jessica mentioned. Screening questions. When we are called to see a patient in the emergency department, we have screening questions. We don't sit down with our clipboard and say, okay, can you leave your job or situation if you want? We don't just check off. We gain that rapport. It can take maybe 2-3 hours for us to sit and talk to that patient. We got to gain their trust, gain that rapport, and then we kind of just ask questions if they come up. We talk about like their daily activities, what they like to do, especially if they're minors. What's school like? If they go to school, where do you sleep at night? What did you have for dinner? Kind of questions like that, just to kind of that conversation without bringing red flags to ourselves and having that patient kind of question, why are they asking so many questions? They do work. I've had a 13-year-old patient that was brought in, and the ED recognized there was some red flags. So we were brought in, actually, I think it was Morgan and I, and talked to this patient, and some of these screening questions came up, and it come to find out that she's been trafficked by 2 adult males. She believed these 2 adult males were looking out after her. She disclosed that she loves to have sex. She does it consensually. She likes to have it. She's looking for love. She's looking for somebody to love her. But there's these 2 guys that have been looking out after her, teaching her the streets, teaching her how to, you know, keep the money and this. And so when she mentioned money, I'm like, do you keep all the money? Like, because she mentioned about the sex that she has with these guys, they buy her stuff, they give her stuff. So she disclosed that she does not keep the money. These guys hold the money for her. And I want to scream to tell her, like, you're being trafficked. These guys are using you. I did not. It took everything for me to kind of bite my tongue and not say that. Again, I want her to trust trust me, and kind of get more detail. So that was, unfortunately, I do believe she went into a home. So when we care for human trafficking patients, medical evaluation always comes first. We always want to do that first. They're seen in the emergency department. We're consulted, we come see the patient. We attempt to separate the patient and the visitor as much as we can with keeping everybody safe. Again, we definitely don't want to ask them if they're being trafficked. Most victims don't know that they're being trafficked, especially in the pediatric population. And some adults don't think they're being trafficked, especially if it's a family or that boyfriend trafficker. We don't want to be judgmental, whether they think like that 13-year-old is selling sex. You know, state of Pennsylvania, children cannot sell sex. We don't want to be judgmental in any age, any gender. One thing that I teach the emergency department staff, and even out in the community, that we're not going to rescue that patient on that one shot. It might take a couple times. We might never rescue that patient. But when they walk into the emergency department, we want to empower that victim. We want to empower our patients to know that there are places to go. There's resources out there if they need it or if they are capable, like the YWCA, come to the emergency department. There's numerous of community resources out there. Of course, but if they are under the age of 18, we have to contact children, youth, and law enforcement to report this. So if we do suspect something and that visitor will not leave the patient's room, we kind of like to say that patient has to go for an x-ray or maybe get a urine sample. We can walk them to the bathroom. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So we always want to evaluate on a case-to-case basis. We do not want to risk further harm to the patient and to the staff. So it might just be safer for us to allow that potential trafficker to stay with the patient. We're going to risk that opportunity to talk to them more, but we don't want to risk that opportunity to provide medical treatment. The traffickers are not going to bring their victim in just for like a wellness check. Most of them don't have primary care physicians. So we don't want to risk medical treatment. We don't want to, especially if it's a possible sexually transmitted infections. We really want to get them seen if it's abdominal pain, whatever their reason for coming into the emergency department. We don't want to risk that medical treatment. So we want to just provide that medical care if that's the only thing that we can do at that time. So trauma doesn't have like one face. It's not, I just want to say like movies, it's not somebody that's like terrorized and like they went through something. I'd have patients come in literally laughing, whether it's sexual assault or possible human trafficking, they came in laughing. I had patients taking selfies during the medical forensic exam. Everybody responds differently to trauma. PTSD, you can have your flashback nightmares, memory loss. So that memory loss, even if it was just the assault or being trafficked happened, and you just came to the emergency department, even though that happened recently, you still might not be able to remember things. You might block yourself out. So things are just kind of seen in like spurts of the moment. You might forget stuff, you might get things confused. Anger, guilt, shame, you might think it's your fault. And then just unable to concentrate. You got so much going on in your brain. Your brain is trying to heal from this trauma. So your brain's just unable to concentrate. Maybe victims, survivors start becoming detached from reality. They just want to skip out of this world and not even remember that this happened to them. The reckless self-destructive behavior, they might just say, screw it, I don't care anymore. They're going to start acting destructive. In the long run, as nurses, we always got to worry about that depression, anxiety. So we always, in our sexual assault patient, domestic violence, possible human trafficking victims, we go through discharge papers to make sure if any of these, what I just mentioned, that they seek out counseling help. That trauma bond, I know this mentioned before, but that loyalty to the trafficker, they don't want to snitch on them. They don't want to tell on their trafficker. They get that strong emotional bond. They might even love their trafficker. The trafficker saved them. They're giving them all the world at the beginning. And then they manipulate them into trusting and believing that they love them, that they're their girl. So it's in that small acts of kindness that trafficker is going to really get a hold of that victim. So our role, so again, number one, compassionate, comprehensive, trauma-informed care. Our exams can take up to 3 to 6, sometimes 7 hours, depending on what was reported, the emotional response of the patient. We ask very detailed questions. We ask, Steve mentioned earlier, they're coming on the worst day of their life. So we're asking very detailed questions about their body, about their assault. Human trafficking, it can even take longer because this might be an ongoing thing. So this might be weeks, months, years of being assaulted. We perform a head to toe examination. We're looking for bruises, any injuries to the patient's body. Our patient's body is our crime scene. So like law enforcement, they go out to the scene, they look for evidence. We're looking for evidence on our patient's body. We're going to collect biological or trace evidence. We're very educated on injury identification. We need to know the difference if it's an injury or if it's like a normal variant. So is it caused by injury or if it's just something normal or by accident? Along with that injury, we take photos. We do a documentation through our photos. Sometimes our photos can be released if it goes to trial, and that would be through a subpoena as well. And that's just our hospital policy. I know other forensic nursing programs might have different policies. One important thing is we want to test and prophylactically treat for sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, hepatitis B and C, and then syphilis. We collect specimens if that patient reports something that they might not remember all the parts of the night, or if maybe they had one drink and they felt more drunk than usual. I mean, I had patients say like, I drink a lot and I felt completely drunk. So we would take evidence, blood and urine, to test for any possible like date rape drugs. Documentation. So after we spend how many hours that patient needs, we'll spend another 3 to 4 hours on documenting. Our document is part of that evidence that is handed over with our evidence collection used in that court of law for possible prosecution. So we want to make sure our documentation is as perfect as it can get. Along with all of that, maintain a chain of custody. I think I'll talk about that on the next slide. With the discharge, we want to provide support. We want to provide resources to that community care. We want to offer follow-up care if needed. And all in all, if this case would ever go to court, We are utilized to testify as, we can testify as fact or expert witness. Most of the time, it might take a year or two for our sexual assault cases to go to court, so our documentation really helps us remember our patients. So I wanted to add our sexual assault evidence collection kit. Some people call it a rape kit. This is what's included. It's issued by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's standard at all programs. It includes clothing bag. Actually, the envelopes are numbered. It includes oral swabs for materials such as, like, we might find hair. Sometimes I collected grass clippings, dirt, gravel. Sometimes even even if some women might have fake fingernails that have fallen off. Sometimes they don't want to give me their fingernails, but I'll try to grab that. Vaginal penile swabs, and then anal perianal swabs. Buccal swab is inside the cheek to get their DNA. So you can see in the picture, we use a digital camera. The smaller kit is our drug facilitated. We obtain blood and urine. We use alternative light source that can pick up, that's the orange glasses with a little, it's like a little flashlight. So an orange light, a blue light with the orange glasses can possibly pick up any semen, saliva, or urine. And actually new evidence, research has been found that we can possibly pick up that forceful contact for possible strangulation. As the evidence tape, we seal all those packages. A roller is used for all of our photos. Any bruises, we measure that. Here is some more pictures. I'm a little close. Each item of clothing that we collect is we put in a separate bag. We do have fundraisers, and actually the community will donate clothes for our patients, shirts, leggings, underwear. I know there was a group of women who donated bags and bags of leggings, and our patients really appreciated them. Sometimes our clothes are even nicer than what our patients come in, so it kind of gives them dignity when they walk out of the hospital that, they have a pair of new clothes. Remember years ago, we didn't have clothes to give to them. The YWCA would have clothes. Sometimes they didn't have clothes. We would send them out in those, I don't know if anybody knows, the hospital paper scrubs. I hated doing that, but if we would collect their underwear or pants and they couldn't leave without clothes, that's the only thing that we had. So we try to do like clothing drives to help our patients with these clothes. So to the chain of custody, when all this is done, we discharge the patient, we package up our evidence, we get ready to hand over to law enforcement. So this is really important. Every time I testify, this question has been asked all the time. This kind of just proves who has possession. So I have possession of this kit. When I open it, it doesn't leave my eyesight, it doesn't leave me, nobody else is around my kit. I document this exchange of evidence. So once I close this kit, law enforcement comes. Sometimes they will come right after the patient has discharged and I hand over the kit. Sometimes, we're busy and we have to lock it up. We do lock up our evidence in a double locking system. When the only people who have access are the forensic nurses to that room where evidence is. We make kind of an agreement or schedule a date and time for us to come and for law enforcement to come pick up this evidence, and we do an exchange. It's a paper. I sign it, date and time, then they sign it, date and time. And this actually kind of maintains that integrity of forensic evidence. It shows that we dried it, packaged it, labeled it, sealed it, and we stored it correctly. That's acceptable in the court of law.
What Nicole does. So Heather is a prosecutor sitting there, and I saw your pupils dilating wildly because you're thinking, and you're right, she's been accepted as an expert witness in 4 counties. And so this is so, you think about evidence class and blah, blah, blah. This is real life evidence. This is the real life of all those evidence classes and textbooks and blah, blah, blah. And then you have a prosecutor and Jesse who was here. so Nicole, collect this evidence and you see how careful and detailed it is. And then it gets handed to a trooper and then eventually Heather's got it. And Heather's gonna put somebody like Nicole or Morgan on the stand. And they're gonna walk through every single step of this to nail down what happened. And how that patient then was not only a human being, but also a de facto crime scene. But this is the kind of expertise that will send a bad guy to jail. And this is that's the kind of evidence I know. I mean, when I think about experts I put on, you put on, and I'm like, she was beaming, listening to you, beaming, thinking, I want to get her
I did
on
it
the
just for
stand.
you.
So look, we are done. We are done. All right, so listen, thank you all so much for participating in Zoom and here. We can hang for a minute, but I mean, thank you for hanging with us. You never know when you're in a position to make a phone call. If you see something, it's not just for terror. If you see something, say something. This is for badness to any human being at any time. Thank you.
Those of you on Zoom, please look at the chat for the CLE link so you can get your credits. Those of you in person should receive the form up front, and that concludes our CLE for tonight. Thank you for coming.